All right, here we go. This is my second vlog um, for my reaction for my book. For the second book, I read The New Jim Crow, and it took me exponentially longer to get this book read because uh, because I was taking notes essentially throughout the whole thing. Um, I chose this book because, as we've discussed in class, sometimes I can get confrontational, and some of these confrontations that take place via social media forums, and just reflecting on some of the conversations and arguments I've gotten into. It's revolved around this idea that racism is no longer around because it's not as overt, and we don't have the traditionally thought of lynchings. The KKK is not as I don't want to say prevalent because I think they are, but they're not as covered. They don't hold as much strength as they once did. So because of these things, racism it doesn't exist anymore. And I'm like, this is totally not true. So when I saw the new Jim Crow, I'm like, boom, this is the book I have to go with. It's gonna talk to me about how racism has evolved and it has changed, and that is exactly what Michelle Alexander delivered. Um, just freaking an awesome book. So what were some of the key things that I learned about? Um, I mean, I could spend a whole hour talking about one component, but um, one of the things. So in her introduction, she went back and she discussed the origins of the caste system, and I was one circumstance, one revolution, one rebellion. That's what I'm looking for. Was Bacon's rebellion, and I had never heard of this before in my life, but she describes it as this guy named Bacon, who white guy, who grabbed the native communities, he grabbed the poor white communities, and he grabbed the black communities, and they tried to overthrow this oppressive system. He got all of these poor people to work together, these oppressed communities to work together to try to overthrow this system. And what I found super interesting was that in order to squash something like that in the future, the elitists had to implement and devise a system that favored whites over blacks to further create that division. And we've talked about the microaggressions, in like calling the natives savages, right? So just subtle things like that, and giving menial jobs to whites, but that were still considered above work that blacks were doing. Just further created this division, and I found that to be super enlightening, and it makes sense. And we've talked about this before in the videos and how this systemic oppression has taken on a life of its own, essentially. So I thought that was super interesting. Um, one other one other thing from the introduction that I found to be just awful was the fact that in the 80s, sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. In the in the 80s, in the 90s, the war on drugs, um, skip ahead about 300 years here, um, but how the war on drugs was perpetuated and um, just further integrated into people's ideologies that blacks were, the crack babies, the crack whores, um, the drug dealers, and the gangbangers, and how that just further perpetuated the stigma of blacks being, not, I don't want to say subhuman, but not nearly as educated or proper as whites, further perpetuating that divide. Um, and that the CIA blocked local law enforcements, from investigating these illegal drug networks because they were funding Nicaragua in their own war. So I thought that how these systemic choices, how these systemic implementations essentially stoked fear and divide, and it's sad and it's disheartening. Um, but I guess in the bigger scheme of things, when Michelle Alexander talks about how even when blacks and people of color get into the system and then they get out of the system, they have now entered the unidentified new caste system. And I've never thought about this, but every single time you apply for a job, have you ever been convicted of a felony? Well, once you get out of the system and you have to check mark that box, you are automatically disqualified from any, I would say, and this is not backed by any statistical support that I have at my disposal, but you are automatically disqualified from any occupations that could get you financial security. So, so they're hamstrung. They are limited to McDonald's, Burger King, car washes, just the minimum wage jobs. That's those are their only options. Well, how do you make more money than that? How do you live a more comfortable life? Well, one way is to illegally sell drugs. So then you get this perpetuating, dovetailing system where we say, okay, now that you've been convicted of a felony, you can no longer hold positions of meaning, essentially, unless you're white, like Donald Trump, where you have allegations and you have enough money to pay people off, right? Well, that's part of the system that we've created. If you have money, then you can get yourself out of these types of situations. Well, the traditionally underserved communities don't have generational wealth, or even not even wealth, but generational stability. They don't have that. It is an everyday fight for your life. And it's just it's sad. And it's one of those situations that it was started a long, long time ago, and it is going to take a lot of conscious work and effort to make change. One other thing I need to touch on here, being mindful of time, coming up on 10 minutes. So how does this book help connect to other things in class? Well, one thing I've personally said, and this was before I got into the program, was that stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason. while I believed that to be true, I think that train of thought parallels internalized oppression. So I wrote a couple of notes down here. The complexity of identity. Who am I? By Daniel Tatum. When you are who the surrounding world says you are, that is part of the internalized oppression. Oh, I'm black. I'm from an inner city. This is what all these people have been telling me, that my mom was a crack whore. That this is all a part of that internalized oppression. And that, I think, a part of that too is the cognitive dissonance, where it's like, I don't believe that is me, but people continuously tell me that is who I am. Well, I'm just gonna prove them right. What's the point in fighting it? I may as well just fit the mold. And along with that is from the article of Peer Support for African American Male College Achievement, Beyond Internalized Racism and the Burden of Acting White by Sean Harper, is that some of those perpetuating messages also run along the lines of, well, if you like to read, it says in this passage here, societal messages that devalue and feminize things, like if you enjoy reading a book, classified as a sissy. Well, you've got this dovetail of oppressive tactics where we're not allowing movement amongst classes financially, and if you do end up in the system, then we hamstring you even more, because now you do not qualify for these jobs that could achieve generational wealth, or I'd be more inclined to say stability. And it's just this never-ending dovetail of oppressive systems and tactics. How's this book changed me? In what ways am I thinking differently? I thought it was good enough to just not commit microaggressions and, the fresh off the boat conversations, or, you're whitewashed, or, whatever. But it is evident that there needs to be a systemic change, and there needs to be perpetual people need to be conscientious and cognizant of the fact that this is an issue that needs to be addressed at every single point in turn. We have been inundated with this caste system since this country began, and we need to actively, every single day, in every single capacity that we can, to try to dismantle racism and this caste system. And it's just, it needs to be done. It needs to be done. I know I'm over time here by about 2 minutes, so I'm very, very sorry. But those are my thoughts on the new Jim Crow. Thank you.